Welcome in to CBS News 24/7. I'm Elizabeth Cook. Let's take a live look at the White House briefing room where any moment now, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt is going to brief reporters, and likely to come up today, questions about that 1-hour phone call between President Trump and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Their first time speaking since that off-the-rails meeting at the Oval Office a couple weeks ago. President Trump called the conversation, quote, very good in a social media post. He also posted that the discussion was based on that 2-hour phone call with President Putin yesterday, adding the negotiations are very much on track. So here's a closer look at those terms agreed to by both Trump and Putin. An immediate 30-day ceasefire on energy and infrastructure, negotiations on a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, negotiations toward a full ceasefire, and a prisoner exchange of 175 people from both Russia and Ukraine. However, both sides are accusing each other of carrying out missile strikes. One caused an explosion at an oil depot in Russia, and another caused a hospital to go up in flames in Ukraine. Let's go to CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi for more on all this. Olivia, thank you for being with us. What else do we know about that phone call?
Yeah, Liz, it's good to be with you. We know that that phone call lasted just about an hour. President Donald Trump posting on Truth Social that they spoke, and the majority of that phone call was based on his phone call yesterday with Russian President Putin, where they discussed essentially what the terms of this ceasefire could be. You see the Truth Social post there. And I do want to note this is the first time that Trump and Zelenskyy have spoken since that Oval Office blow up several weeks ago, where we saw President Zelenskyy leave the White House with no deliverables or deals in the forms of that critical minerals deal that had potentially been discussed. Trump said they did talk today. It was a good phone call, he categorized it as. He also said we're expected to hear more from Secretary of State Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz about this call, giving details specifically about what was discussed, but we do know that they did talk about what they're calling this ceasefire. Now, it's not an unconditional ceasefire. That's what the U.S. was putting forth, but what it is it's an agreement from both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians, to not attack critical energy infrastructure on either side. That's key. That's the first stepping stone to all of this, really, to really have a more hammered out, long-term lasting ceasefire deal that the U.S. is pursuing.
So, Olivia, what's the next step? Is the ball essentially in Zelenskyy's court now to come back with his own agreement?
Well, the next step seems like, from what we've heard from officials, especially Steve Witkoff, he is the special envoy dealing with the Middle East, who's also dealing in negotiations here. It seems like the next step is all of these parties will be heading to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia next week. That starts on Monday, where they're really going to hammer out the minutia, like the small details of all of these points that they've been discussing, because they're talking in large terms right now. That's what most of these leaders do. Once they get into the nitty-gritty and what's actually on the table, who would give up what plot of land, who would give up access to certain materials, energy, access to the Black Sea. All of these sorts of things are things that need to be hammered out critically in all of this. So we do know from Steve Witkoff that Secretary Rubio and Mike Waltz will be heading back to Jeddah on Monday. That's next week. They'll be heading back to Saudi Arabia, and we should expect to hear more from the Ukrainians and Russians of who they're sending of those representatives. But it seems like that would be the next step of all of these calls that they've been having to really hammer out all of these details. Trump has tasked his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor with really being the ones to lead the charge in the negotiations on this process.
All right, while we have you, Olivia, we just heard that President Trump gave an update on Iran. What did he say?
Yeah, this came in the form of a Truth Social post. I want to read it to you. This just happened right now. Trump wrote that reports are coming in that while Iran has lessened its intensity on military equipment and general support to the Houthis, they are still sending large levels of supplies. He then wrote, Iran must stop sending these supplies immediately. Let the Houthis fight it out themselves. Either way, they lose, but this way, they will lose quickly. Now, to put this into context, this comes as Trump has really escalated the U.S. military campaign in Yemen against the Iranian-backed Houthis. Since Saturday, we have seen consistent bombarding and targeted strikes on the Houthis, on their encampments, weapons depots, on training camps, drone sites. We have seen pretty consistent attacks from the U.S. military onto Iranian-backed Houthis. So now Trump is really sending a warning to Iran, saying, stay out of this, let us fight this, stop sending them materials and supplies, and saying ultimately that he hopes the Houthis will lose anyways. This way they just lose quicker. This comes, of course, as Trump is trying to really reset U.S. foreign policy, end certain conflicts, as we're seeing in Ukraine, certainly escalating some in Yemen.
All right, CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi. Thank you so much, Olivia. Always great to be with you. All right, switching gears, let's take a look at the markets as Wall Street braces for the Federal Reserve to issue its next interest rate decision today. Let's look at those numbers. The Dow currently up about 200 points. Inflation is still well above the Fed's target, though, but a welcome change as last week marked the first drop in consumer prices after 4 straight months of increases. Now, about an hour and a half, we'll see if that informs a decision on easing interest rates or keep them steady. Let's bring in CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady. Kelly, what should we be looking for from the Federal Reserve Chair today?
So we are expecting them to hold interest rates steady. But the real news is going to be about what Chair Powell says in the press conference after and the economic projections that we're expecting to get from them as well in their press release. And what we are looking for is how the Fed sees inflation developing, GDP developing, as well as the number of interest rate cuts that we can expect this year. At the last few meetings, we have expected to see 2 interest rate cuts this year, likely coming the summer onwards. But given all of the uncertainty right now with tariffs and consumer confidence, we could get an update on that 2 number. Some analysts are predicting maybe 1, maybe none this year. So that's one piece of what we're looking for. And we're also going to be looking for how Chair Powell frames this uncertain time that we are in. Is he more concerned about potentially inflation being reignited by some of these tariff policies, or is he more concerned about the labor market and a slowdown in consumer spending? So we're going to be in that meeting, Liz, at 2:30 p.m. We're going to be asking questions to Chair Powell. He doesn't often give too much information, but we're going to try our best.
Yeah, speaking of consumers, Kelly, let's talk about retail sales. Consumer confidence, we know, is pretty low right now. Do you think stores are going to start offering more sales incentives to get people to pull out their wallets? Or given the tariff situation, can the stores afford to do that?
That is a really interesting balance, Liz. And so this past few weeks, we have heard from retail CEOs, whether it be Walmart, Target, Best Buy, you name it, that they are seeing a slowdown in consumer spending, and they're projecting slower sales than they originally did at the beginning of this year. And so, in fact, Walmart, Amazon, Best Buy, and Target have all announced sales that are coming or are either ongoing right now. And these are kind of 1-week sales to supercharge getting the consumer back into store. They're kind of billed as a spring sale, if you will, and each of them are having very steep discounts across a number of different product categories. But I think what is interesting is that tension that you just hit on. We also have looming tariffs, which we would expect to see an increase in price in order to pass that on to consumers so it doesn't hurt the company's margins. And so I think what you're seeing is these companies try to get consumers in the door right now back to buying, get that get them spending those dollars ahead of these reciprocal tariffs that we're expecting to come into place April 2nd.
This I thought was really interesting, Kelly. One of the leading business schools, UCLA Anderson School of Business, warning of a recession for the first time ever. What does that indicate to you, and how likely is a recession?
So this was pretty surprising because the survey, this is not something that they have predicted in the past. So the fact that they are coming out and saying that there is a possibility of a recession was definitely noteworthy. What I will highlight is they also said, look, this is not something that we see coming in the immediate future or even the near-term future based on the economic data, but it's more about what could happen with these confusing tariff policies. Are they going to be in place? Are they not? Is it a negotiating tool? As well as consumer confidence. We have seen consumer confidence rebound quickly in the past, but we are also seeing people potentially start to spend less. And when you have people spending less, that's when you see GDP slow, because consumer spending accounts for 2/3 of GDP. And so I also looked, in addition, after I saw this survey, at what are some of the other banks saying. JP Morgan has it under 50%. Goldman Sachs has it at 20%. So we're not over 50%. We are not saying that a recession is likely, but you are starting to see people talk about this more, given so much uncertainty, Liz.
Yeah, the R word is always very scary to a lot of people. Kelly O'Grady, thanks so much for joining us. Well, dozens of Teslas set on fire, and the Attorney General is calling them acts of domestic terrorism. You're watching CBS News 24/7. Anger in Israel over Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's decision to launch a series of deadly airstrikes on Gaza, shattering a nearly 2-month-long ceasefire. Netanyahu defends the bombing as a way to put pressure on Hamas to release the remaining hostages, but protesters say the military's action is a death sentence for those hostages. CBS News foreign correspondent Remy Inocencio is in Tel Aviv with the very latest.
Yes, and while Gaza's health ministry says that one foreign national was killed, the UN said in a statement, quote, reports are coming in that a UN ops colleague has been killed in a detonation. It added it was also understood that there are at least 5 other casualties, several of whom are very severely injured, and that this location apparently had been deconflicted with the Israel Defense Forces. That's also coming from the UN. This compound is in Deir al-Balah in the central part of the Strip. Those workers, we understand, are now getting treatment. What's notable is that the UN is not, at least right now, directly blaming the IDF for those deaths, and that the circumstances are still unclear. But separately, the IDF is saying it targeted what it says is a Hamas military site in the southern Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone. This is near the border with Egypt. At least 2 civilians were killed there. That's according to the Red Crescent. And after other strikes too, 1 woman and child were killed just north in Khan Yunis, while 4 others were killed in northern Gaza City. That's according to local reports. And now looking at this is the second night of Israeli strikes, breaking that nearly 2-month ceasefire. And the reaction from here in Israel has also been emotional, from the families and supporters of hostages still in Gaza in particular. It's anger, exasperation, fear that this renewed bombing will kill their loved ones. We spoke to an IDF spokesman yesterday on this, and he said that while his heart goes out to those hostage families, he claimed, his words, history shows that military pressure could bring back hostages. Off of that, we spoke to a retired IDF general who flatly disagreed. This is Israel Ziv.
Look, we know over a year now that military pressure does not bring back the hostages. And in some cases the other way. It kills hostages. So, to my opinion, unfortunately, if we keep on just with those raids and attacks, I think we're going to see more hostages dead.
And you heard it there. That is from a general with 3 decades of experience and commanded Israeli forces in Gaza himself. Now, despite this, Netanyahu, we know, has doubled down on military action. We are expecting more strikes in the coming days. Back to you.
Ramy, thank you. Let's take a live look now at New York, where the city's transit agency is under mounting pressure from the federal government on 2 fronts. They're up against a Friday deadline to end its congestion pricing program. And now the Trump administration is threatening to pull funding if it doesn't hand over data about crime on the city's subway system. Our partners at CBS News New York are on top of this story. Let's listen in to their coverage from just moments ago.
In this letter from the Department of Transportation, Secretary Sean Duffy is directing the MTA to provide information on plans to reduce crime, stop assaults on transit workers, and deter fare evasion. If not, the DOT is threatening to withhold billions of dollars in funding. MTA Chairman and CEO Jana Lieber speaking with us for the first time since these demands were made on Tuesday.
We have done so much to improve subway safety, and right now crime in the subway is down 45% versus the period right before pandemic.
We caught up with him in Midtown. Lieber told us he plans to communicate with Secretary Duffy about this directive and will provide detailed information to him.
General, what does this mean moving forward? Are there plans in place to have discussions with Sean Duffy?
Yeah, I mean, they asked us for very detailed information, and we're going to prepare a letter in response. We have actually the lowest number of daily crimes in the subway system than we have ever had in recorded history in the first part of this year.
While the letter says nothing about congestion pricing, it comes as the Trump administration has set a Friday deadline to end the tolling program. And back out here live, we know that Governor Hochul and the MTA are planning to continue congestion pricing. Keep in mind that the MTA relies on billions of dollars from the federal government. In fact, in its current capital program, we know it's worth $68.4 billion. It's asking the federal government for $14 billion. And we know right now that potentially could be in jeopardy depending on the outcome of what transpires. That's the very latest here in Midtown. Elijah Westbrook, CBS News, New York.
And you were just watching coverage from our partners there at CBS News New York. Meanwhile, the FBI is searching for a person of interest who attacked a Tesla repair center in Vegas with Molotov cocktails. It's just the latest in more than a dozen cases of arson and vandalism targeting Tesla. Attorney General Pam Bondi is calling them acts of domestic terrorism. Now, this drone video shows the damage from those fires at the Vegas repair center. Andres Gutierrez is in Las Vegas with the very latest.
This fiery scene outside a Las Vegas Tesla repair shop shows multiple vehicles set ablaze just before 3 a.m. Tuesday. The word resist was spray painted on the front of the building.
We believe the suspect approached the business wearing all black clothing, and he used what appeared to be Molotov cocktails and a firearm to conduct his attack.
Just hours earlier in Kansas City, 2 Tesla Cybertrucks were set on fire at a dealership. At least 15 reports of vandalism to Tesla vehicles and dealerships have been made in the U.S. this year.
I love Tesla.
While promoting Tesla last week, President Trump said vandals would be prosecuted as terrorists for targeting Musk's cars.
We're going to catch you, and you're going to go through hell.
It creates sympathy in a positive way for most folks.
Alexander Edwards is the president of automotive research and consulting firm Strategic Vision. He says while the vandalism might not hurt Tesla's brand, it needs a new strategy.
They absolutely can find some success coming out of this. But if you're going to aggressively attack those who were already in your camp and loved you, that's not a winning solution.
Andres Gutierrez, CBS News, Las Vegas.
All right, check this out. It's a whiteout in Nebraska. Much of the state is under a blizzard warning, and winds there could reach up to 70 miles an hour. I want to bring in meteorologist Jessica Birch on tracking the storms moving across the country. We know this part of the country is not, you know, they're accustomed to cold temperatures, but this is extreme.
The winds on top of that,
Crazy.
though. You know, and you just mentioned 70-mile-per-hour winds. We've seen even gustier conditions over into New Mexico and Utah. 101-mile-per-hour winds were reported just within the past 24 hours. So this wind event, this storm that's sweeping across these plains, it's impacting millions. And so I'm going to dive into that right now, where it's at, where it's going. As we head into the next 72 hours, you'll continue to watch this storm really sweep across states close to the Great Lakes as it brings in more heavy snow, anywhere up to around 12 inches, and plenty of rain as it pushes off to the coast, closer to the New England area just within the next 72 hours. Now, taking a look behind me, a couple things to mention. Like I said, we saw wind gusts up to around 100 miles per hour over into Alta up in Utah and all the way down into cities in New Mexico as well. As that wind event moved its way off into the east, it was really just that driving factor for the storm as it continues to rotate its way across the plains, moving up to the Great Lakes as we head into the next 24 hours. Here's where it's at 7 o'clock tonight. Now we're starting to see lake effect snow all the way across some of the higher elevated areas and close to the Great Lakes. We also notice plenty of snow on the back end of that system, and on the front leaning edge, plenty of thunderstorm activity possible. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, severe weather is possible widespread throughout all these states, but right now our severe weather outlook is highlighting the bullseye just south of Chicago. That enhanced risk really sits just about 20 miles south of Chicago, and what that means for us, especially in this region, is we can see tornado activity. We could potentially see thunderstorm activity widespread throughout all of this region. And to add to that, we're going to see plenty of snow and rain mix, anywhere up to around 12 inches expected just across some of those lower elevated areas along the Great Lakes. And we're going to keep a close eye on that as we head into the coming days. But of course, wind, snow mix, it makes sense why there's plenty of blizzard warnings that are still in effect right now.
They're really getting everything.
They are.
Wind, rain, all of it, snow,
Potential for
whiteout.
tornado activity. It's pretty severe right now, yeah.
It's tough. All right, Jess, thanks so much.
Of course.
The family of the missing University of Pittsburgh student is requesting that officials officially declare their daughter dead, believing she drowned off the coast of the Dominican Republic. The last known person to see her, Joshua Reeb, he's in court yesterday, or was in court yesterday, fighting against what his attorneys call illegal detention. And Bojorquez was at that court hearing and has this report from Punta Cana.
As you know, 22-year-old Joshua Ribby has not been named a suspect here in the Dominican Republic. He has not been charged with anything. He has been a witness in this investigation. And therefore, the judge said yesterday that he should not be detained. Ribby told that judge that he was surrounded by police at all times while he was at the hotel. Even to leave, they needed a police escort. The judge said, look, he's a witness. He doesn't deserve that kind of treatment. So the judge's ruling really paves the way for Ribby to be able to return to the United States. But there's a question of his passport. The judge did not clearly address that. Ribby has said that it was confiscated by authorities. So we're waiting to see if perhaps he reaches out to the U.S. Embassy for some assistance getting home. The family of Kananki, Sudiksha Kananki, tearfully said yesterday that they do believe that this was an accidental drowning. And in fact, in court yesterday, Ribby acknowledged to the judge that when the family was here, those parents looking for answers, that they gave him a hug. They said that they believed him and that they said, thank you for trying to save our daughter. Back to you.
Thank you, Manuel. We'll take a live look inside the White House, where White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt just began speaking to reporters about President Trump's call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Well, the very latest. Stay with us. Welcome back to CBS News 24/7. President Donald Trump wrapped up a call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy just a short time ago. And Trump called the conversation, quote, very good in a social media post. He also posted the discussion was based on that 2-hour phone call with President Putin yesterday, adding the negotiations are very much on track. Joining us live now from Washington is Steven Stavanovich, a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasian Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Steven, thank you so much for being with us. So,
pleasure.
What do you take out of today's conversation? What came out of it?
Well, Trump wanted to touch base with Zelenskyy to make clear that they were still talking to the Ukrainians. He said that he wanted to make sure that Russian and Ukrainian requests and needs, this is the language of the Post, were very much aligned. Unfortunately, both the call to Putin yesterday and the call to Zelenskyy today make clear that their interests, their requests and needs are not very much aligned. And Trump is trying to put a kind of good face on both of these conversations to indicate that they're moving toward peace. But in reality, the call, particularly with Putin yesterday, produced much less than Trump had hoped for.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that hours after Trump and Putin spoke yesterday, Russia launched a series of drone strikes on civilian targets in Ukraine. So does this give the Trump administration more leverage, perhaps, to push for a broader agreement here?
Well, it gives them a reason to want a broader agreement. The one that Putin agreed to is very limited. And it, in fact, is less than Trump had claimed afterwards. He said they'd agreed on energy and infrastructure ceasefires. Really, the Kremlin said, no, it's only energy infrastructure. What Trump has said is that there are going to be new talks on Sunday in Saudi Arabia, which will attempt to extend the ceasefire beyond energy infrastructure, although even that hasn't been formalized. They want to go to a maritime ceasefire, then to broader long-range targeting, and ultimately a full ceasefire. But the conditions that both sides are particularly attaching to this are going to make this extremely difficult. They're very far apart.
Yeah, I mean, the main sticking point, it sounds like, for Russia is that Putin wants any kind of foreign aid to Ukraine, be it money or military arms, to stop. Do you see that ever happening?
I think it would be terrible if it did happen. It just in the past month, the United States did cut off aid to Ukraine, and Putin is obviously interested in having a renewal of that kind of cut. But he hasn't given the president much basis for agreeing to anything that drastic.
What about the rest of Europe? Where do they stand with all this? I mean, we've been talking a lot about President Trump in conversations with Vladimir Putin and now Zelenskyy today. But what about the other countries that are very much invested in what happens in this war?
Sure. Zelenskyy was in Helsinki today, meeting with the Finnish president, our new NATO ally, and got a strong boost of support from President Stubb, who said, we have to be NATO, Western governments have to be able to strengthen Ukraine because, Russia is saying no, and there has to be an increase in pressure. Trump probably ought to let it be known to Putin that he's considering increasing arms to Ukraine, increasing sanctions, which he mentioned in the past couple of weeks. Trump doesn't want to talk about that publicly right now because he wants to make it seem as though the talks are proceeding well, on track, as he said today. But he needs to get Putin to think more seriously about the kinds of conditions that would actually make it possible for an agreement to be reached.
Yeah, looking at the situation from 10,000 feet, so to speak, what does this sort of negotiations mean for President Vladimir Putin's, position in the world? We know he's wanted a seat at the table with the U.S. He wants those relations to improve. Do you see that happening, given the negotiations that are happening right now?
Well, Putin obviously would like to be restored to polite society as a great power in good standing who can visit other countries, particularly European countries. He hasn't really been able to go anywhere except North Korea and Mongolia of late. So that's an incentive for him, but it's not clear that it's enough of an incentive. The way in which improved Russian-American relations are figuring in the talks so far is that Trump is kind of dangling that prospect in front of Putin, the possibility of a meeting soon. He's dangling that prospect as an incentive for Putin. What we don't see is that that's a strong enough incentive for Putin to make a lot of other concessions related to the war.
All right, Stephen Sestanovich with the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Well, right now, the Justice Department pushing back on a federal judge's demand for more information on those deportation flights of suspected Venezuelan gang members. More than 200 migrants were flown from the U.S. to El Salvador, despite a court order, by the way. Trump invoked the rarely used Alien Enemies Act to justify those flights. So this is what Attorney General Pam Bondi said on the case just a short time ago. Quote, this is another outrageous judicial power grab by an activist judge. No judge has the authority to dictate foreign affairs or turn planes around mid-air. The American people overwhelmingly voted in support of President Trump's historic agenda, allowing unelected judges to usurp executive power as a fundamental threat to our democracy and the rule of law. Now, moments ago at the White House press briefing, Caroline Leavitt commented on that as well. Let's take a listen to that.
Americans can absolutely expect to see the continuation of the mass deportation campaign that has been successfully led by this president, Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, and also our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Since you brought up the judges, I would like to point out that the judges in this country are acting erroneously. We have judges who are acting as partisan activists from the bench. They are trying to dictate policy from the President of the United States. They are trying to clearly slow walk this administration's agenda, and it's unacceptable. As the president said last night, we will continue to comply with these court orders. We will continue to fight these battles in courts. But it's incredibly apparent that there is a concerted effort by the far left to judge shop, to pick judges who are clearly acting as partisan activists from the bench in an attempt to derail this president's agenda. We will not allow that to happen. And not only are they usurping the will of the president and the chief executive of our country, but they are undermining the will of the American public, tens of millions of Americans who duly elected this president to implement the policies that are coming out of this White House.
And then one more question. Senate Minority Leader. All right, let's bring in CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman. Katrina, I want to get your reaction to those comments.
Liz, we did see this in the government's filing. They are trying to argue that the judicial branch is intruding on the executive power with this order. And in fact, the judge has now granted them one more day because they say they want more time to decide if they're going to invoke the state secrets privilege in this case. But also in that order, just in going with what they were just saying, they say that this has devolved into a picayune dispute over the micromanagement of immaterial fact-finding. So they're really trying to say that the judiciary has no place here, and we're just seeing this at a broader level. There are calls to impeach this judge. We are seeing this continuous attack on the judicial system, and the executive branch is just trying to assert more and more authority in these cases and say that this is an intrusion on their rights.
And Katrina, another legal setback for the administration. A federal judge blocked an order barring transgender individuals from serving in the U.S. military. What do we know about that ruling?
Liz, what this judge has said is that equal rights apply to all, and that there really has been no evidence here that there is a reason to not have transgender people in the military. So she's blocking this executive order from preventing this. And she's saying that they wanted it to, the government, only apply to the plaintiffs if this was going to happen. But she said that that would just be too complicated because some people would be allowed to serve, others would not. They would be appealing to the courts. So this is going to apply to all people. And she made some very strong statements here. For one, she compared this to an executive order banning plastic straws. And what she said was that the government provided multiple studies backing up why they thought there should be a ban. Whereas regarding the rights of these transgender people, there's zero evidence to support this need.
And Katrina, before you go, you have an update on Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia University graduate fighting deportation. What can you tell us about that?
Liz, the judge in that case in New York has made a decision that the case is going to move to New Jersey. Now, the government had wanted it in Louisiana. That's where Mahmoud Khalil is currently being detained. But the judge has said that New Jersey is going to be the right forum for this. And the reason is that that's where he was when his lawyers filed a habeas petition. At the time, they thought that he was in New York, Liz. He had been arrested in New York. They were told that he was being brought to a detention center that was in New York. But under Supreme Court precedent, a habeas petition is supposed to be filed where the person is being detained. So that case is now going to move to New Jersey.
All right, CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman. Always great to see you. Thank you, Katrina. JFK documents unsealed. President Trump making good on his promise to release the government files related to the assassination of the president. Caitlin Huey-Burns has been combing through the pages, and she joins us next. You're watching CBS News 24/7. Well, moments ago, we just heard White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt outline that phone call between President Trump and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. CBS News correspondent Chanel Call has been listening to that briefing. Chanel, what can you tell us?
All right, so we just heard this wrap up moments ago. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt read out the White House's take on how that hour-long phone call between Presidents Trump and Zelenskyy went this morning. This was notably their first conversation since that Oval Office meeting about 2 weeks ago, a really fiery meeting that went off the rails. Let's listen.
Bear with me as I read it. Today, President Trump and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy had a fantastic phone conversation. President Zelenskyy thanked President Trump for a productive start for the work of the Ukrainian and American teams in Jeddah on March 11th. The meeting of the senior officials from both nations significantly helped in moving toward ending the war. President Zelenskyy thanked President Trump for the support of the United States, especially the Javelin missiles that President Trump was first to provide in his efforts towards peace. The leaders agreed Ukraine and America will continue working together to bring about a real end to the war, and that lasting peace under President Trump's leadership can be achieved. President Trump fully briefed President Zelenskyy on his conversation with Putin and the key issues discussed. They reviewed the situation in Kursk and agreed to share information closely between their defense staffs as the battlefield situation evolved. President Zelenskyy asked for additional air defense systems to protect his civilians, particularly Patriot missile systems, and President Trump agreed to work with him to find what was available, particularly in Europe. The two leaders also agreed on a partial ceasefire against energy. Technical teams will meet in Saudi Arabia in the coming days to discuss broadening the ceasefire to the Black Sea on the way to a full ceasefire. They agreed this could be the first step toward the full end of the war and ensuring security. President Zelenskyy was grateful for the president's leadership in this effort and reiterated his willingness to adopt a full ceasefire. President Trump also discussed Ukraine's electrical supply and nuclear power plants. He said that the United States could be very helpful in running those plants with its electricity and utility expertise. American ownership of those plants would be the best protection for that infrastructure and support for Ukrainian energy infrastructure. President Zelenskyy also thanked President Trump for continuing to push humanitarian concerns, including the exchange of prisoners of war. He noted they had just had a successful exchange and thanked the president for his leadership on that. President Trump also asked President Zelenskyy about the children who had gone missing from Ukraine during the war, including the ones that had been abducted. And President Trump promised to work closely with both parties to help make sure those children were returned home. They agreed all parties must continue the effort to make a ceasefire work. The presidents noted the positive work of their advisors and representatives, especially Secretary Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, Special Envoy Kellogg, and others. The presidents instructed their teams to move ahead with the technical issues related to implementing and broadening the partial ceasefire. The presidents instructed their advisors and representatives to carry out this work as quickly as possible. The presidents emphasized that in further meetings, the teams can agree on all necessary aspects of advancing toward lasting peace and security. That is a lengthy statement that was just given to me, so thanks for bearing with me. Our office will, of course, provide this after. And as you know, as I just pointed out in the statement, the president's team of negotiators and national security experts will be heading to Saudi again later this week to continue working on and ironing out the details. But I would just like to emphasize we have never been this close to peace, and it's only because of President Trump that we are here. I think a couple of years ago, as you all reported on the war, it was incomprehensible to have a partial ceasefire in this conflict. And today that is true because of the leadership of this president. Mary.
And so you heard there White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt speaking about security guarantees for Ukraine. We know that this was a big issue for President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, a big sticking point for him. Leavitt today saying that Trump agreed to help look into that to see what other resources Europe may be able to offer. So as it stands right now, it does appear there is a possible ceasefire still on the table between Ukraine and Russia. The White House also confirming this afternoon teams from all three countries will be meeting soon in Saudi Arabia next week to further discuss terms to this potential deal.
All right, we'll be looking forward to that meeting. CBS News correspondent Chanel Call. Thanks so much, Chanel. Well, after more than 60 years, we are finally getting access to some government files related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. 80,000 pages of unredacted documents have now been made public, and we have a whole CBS News team working their way through those documents, and that includes CBS News correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns. Caitlin, thank you for being with us. What have we learned from these pages?
Well, the president said that we would be reading for a while, and I can attest that that is very true. There are a lot of documents to get through here. Most of them were released on the National Archives website. There are some that still actually need to be digitized, so those will be uploaded later. And then there is a bunch of them that are still under court seal, so it's not clear if and when we might see those. But if you were looking for a smoking gun or anything to validate conspiracy theories that, of course, have been permeating through the past 60 or so years, you are going to be disappointed. We did not find evidence of anything other than the fact that Harvey Lee Oswald was the lone shooter here. But what this does do, in the administration's view, is offer transparency with the release of these documents. And it does reveal a lot about sources and methods from intelligence services and historians or researchers who, have been reporting and looking into this for a long time, may be able to pick apart some of these documents and corroborate other elements in their research. So there could be a lot to be gained just by all of this being public. But I would also note that a lot of this is really nothing new. A lot of these documents we've seen before. The difference is now that they are fully unredacted.
All right, CBS News correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns, thank you so much for joining us on that. It is part of our mission here at CBS News, our Eye on America series, hearing your stories in your neighborhoods. Now, this story hits home for the millions of people that rely on government-funded media outlets. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration after the White House slashed federal funding for the organization over the weekend. Nearly all 1,300 employees under Voice of America were also placed on leave. Now, the White House says it wants to ensure taxpayers are no longer on the hook for what it calls radical propaganda. The government-owned and operated news organization was launched during World War II to counter Nazi propaganda. VOA went on to broadcast in more than 100 countries and dozens of languages. CBS News correspondent Nancy Cordes spoke with VOA's director, who is now on administrative leave.
Moscow this week.
This is what overseas viewers might have seen on Voice of America last week, and this is what they saw today. A short 30-second video promising that VOA will represent America, though how and when is unclear.
I got an email from HR on Saturday morning. That's when I first learned what was going on.
Michael Abramowitz is the director of VOA. He and all 1,300 employees were placed on administrative leave this weekend after the White House labeled VOA radical propaganda.
I really believe that at VOA, the journalists, by and large, if they have a bias, they hate totalitarianism. They hate tyranny, they hate authoritarianism.
VOA was founded in 1942, broadcasting behind enemy lines and later behind the Iron Curtain.
Here's how jamming sounds when it cuts in on a Voice of America broadcast.
Today, VOA reaches about 360 million people around the world each week and is translated into about 50 different languages. The budget is just over $250 million a year.
Our principal mission is really to tell the story of America.
So you're getting through to an audience that otherwise might only hear propaganda about the U.S.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Trump officials say VOA has been too critical of the commander-in-chief. Trump himself made his distaste clear last week when he got a question from a VOA reporter.
Who are you with?
I'm with Voice of America, sir.
Oh, no wonder. Okay, Voice of
Chinese state media cheered the halting of VOA, calling the outlet a lie factory with an appalling track record.
Right now, VOA is shuttered, and it could be a major, really self-inflicted blow to the national security interests of the United States.
Why is that?
Because it's an incredibly important tool for basically combating Chinese, Russian, Iranian disinformation, for telling the truth to people living under tyranny. If America pulls off the playing field and cedes it to our adversaries, then they're going to be telling the narratives that people around the world are going to be hearing, and that can't be good for America.
They're going to be hearing an anti-American message.
They're going to be hearing an anti-American narrative, and we need to fight that.
A fight that's been knocked off the airwaves for now. Nancy Cordes, CBS News, Washington.
Let's take a live look at Dallas now, where high winds and dry conditions are putting firefighters on high alert. Oklahoma also seeing similar conditions. And if more fires flare up, those are those firefighting helicopters, they're going to have to need help from above from these guys. You're looking at what's called a super scooper plane. 2 of these are helping crews fight fires in Oklahoma. There are only 15 planes like this in the entire country, and they can swoop in over lakes and then fill the tank in just a matter of seconds. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and FDA are announcing Operation Stork Speed. The goal is to make sure families have more options for safe and reliable infant formula. It comes as a new investigation from Consumer Reports finds what it calls potentially harmful levels of heavy metals in some infant formulas. The food safety team tested 41 of the most popular powdered infant formulas for heavy metals and other contaminants.
What were the findings here?
Our findings were mostly good news. There are only 10 that are in our worst choices categories, which had relatively higher levels of lead, inorganic arsenic, and one had BP and acrylamide as well.
Well, you can find more details on the findings on the Consumer Reports website. Google says it is taking legal action against scammers who manipulated searches on its Maps app. The company says it discovered about 10,000 profiles that created fake businesses or took over existing business listings and replaced them with another number. On CBS Mornings Plus, Google's general counsel explained how these false advertising scams impact consumers.
Effectively, it's a bait and switch. They called the number listed on the listing. The person connected them with a different locksmith than the business that was listed. And once that locksmith arrived to the home, they might charge a significantly higher price for that service.
Also, a Hollywood director is being charged with defrauding Netflix out of $11 million. The streamer says they paid Carl Rinsch more than $50 million for an unfinished show. He then asked for $11 million more, saying he needed it to complete the show. But prosecutors allege instead of using that money for production, he transferred it to a personal brokerage account. We have much more ahead here on CBS News 24/7. We're watching the markets just minutes before Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell expected to take the podium there. We are expected to hear his predictions on inflation and the state of the economy next.